If you've been following the news at all, you've definitely heard the phrase abolish ICE, right? It's a chant you hear at protests, it's all over social media, and it's become this huge lightning rod in American politics. But behind that simple three-word slogan, there's a really complex debate happening about immigration, enforcement, and what justice looks like.
So what does it really mean? What are people actually calling for when they say abolish ICE? Is it about open borders, or is it something else entirely? Well, using the sources we've gathered, we're going to break down the arguments, the history, and the human stories that are right at the heart of this entire movement.
Here's how we're going to tackle it. First, we'll get a clear understanding of what ICE even is and where it came from. Then, we'll dive into the Abolish ICE movement itself. After that, we'll hear some personal stories from people directly affected, look at the political fallout, and finally, take a hard look at the broader system that's under all this scrutiny.
Okay, first things first. Before we can even talk about abolishing ICE, we need to be really clear on what the agency is and, just as importantly, where it came from.
So, the official definition: ICE is a federal law enforcement agency. It sits under the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, and its job is to enforce immigration and customs laws inside the country. And that's a key distinction. It's different from Customs and Border Protection, CBP, who you hear about operating mainly at the borders.
Now, here's something that might surprise you. ICE is actually a pretty new agency. I mean, really new. Before 2003, its jobs were spread out across other departments. It was only created after 9/11 as part of that massive government reshuffle that created the Department of Homeland Security. And this is a huge point for the abolition movement because they argue, hey, if the country ran for over 200 years without ICE, it can do it again.
And that history is exactly why this movement for some really fundamental change popped up in the first place.
So while the idea had been around for a while, the slogan, Abolish ICE, just absolutely exploded into the mainstream in the summer of 2018. And the catalyst, the thing that really lit the fuse, was the massive public outrage over the zero-tolerance policy at the border, which led to thousands of kids being separated from their parents.
Now, it's super important to understand what proponents are actually saying. Most aren't calling for zero enforcement. Their argument is that ICE, as it exists today, is the problem. They believe it's morphed into a mass deportation force that goes way beyond just targeting violent criminals, and instead ends up tearing apart families and communities. The proposal is often to dismantle this specific agency and give its necessary jobs, things like investigating human trafficking, back to other agencies. And a huge piece of this is ending the reliance on for-profit detention centers.
To really get why people feel so strongly about this, the sources we looked at pointed to individual stories, accounts that put a human face on these big policy debates.
Let's take the story of Carol Mayorga in Missouri. She was described as a tax-paying soccer mom, someone who had been a beloved part of her community for 20 years. And then one day, she was arrested, put in shackles, and held in detention for weeks. You can imagine the shock that sent through her town. Or how about Marcelo Gomez da Silva? He was an 18-year-old honor student in Massachusetts, came here when he was just 7. He was picked up on his way to volleyball practice and spent 6 days locked up, sleeping on a concrete floor.
And these tactics don't just affect immigrants. They've also impacted U.S. citizens. Andrea Velez in Los Angeles reported being slammed to the ground and then dragged into an unmarked SUV by masked agents who refused to identify themselves. She was later charged with assaulting a federal officer.
And then you have the case of Daniel Ramirez Medina. He was a 23-year-old with DACA status, a dreamer, with no criminal record at all. He was arrested at his home, and his lawyers say that ICE agents tried over and over to pressure him into falsely admitting he was in a gang.
So, stories like these really fueled the movement. But, as you can probably guess, they also triggered a really powerful political backlash. And that's what created this deeply divided debate we see today.
And this really gets us to the heart of the conflict. On one side, you have advocates saying their goal is simple: a humane immigration system, one where violence and abuse aren't just accepted as standard procedure. But on the other side, you have officials arguing that ICE is absolutely essential for national security, that its main job is to get violent criminals off the streets.
And this quote from former President Trump really captures the stark terms of the opposition. The argument is that getting rid of ICE would just lead to total chaos and danger, basically painting the agency as the only thing standing between public safety and lawlessness.
So let's pull the lens back a little bit, because the debate over ICE is also a debate about this huge, sprawling system of immigration detention, and especially its deep reliance on private for-profit companies.
Check this out. An analysis from the ACLU back in 2016 found something pretty staggering. Nearly 3/4, 73% of all ICE detention beds are operated by for-profit corporations. That is a massive share of a system that holds civil detainees, not criminals. And it's a huge jump from 49% back in 2009. This profit motive is a central worry for critics.
And the worries about privatization? Well, they go even deeper. A court found that one of these for-profit operators, the GEO Group, was violating Washington state's minimum wage law. So what were they paying detainees for essential work like cooking and cleaning? $1 a day.
And it's not just the money. Groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center have done deep dives into these privately run facilities, and the reports have documented some really troubling patterns. We're talking about things like inadequate medical care, unsafe conditions where guards won't step in to stop fights, really poor nutrition like spoiled or inedible food, and a serious lack of legal resources, which is obviously critical when you're trying to fight your own deportation case.
And finally, there's this big question of due process, that constitutional guarantee of a fair legal fight. Critics point to the growing use of something called expedited removal. It's basically a fast track for deportations that offers way fewer legal protections than a normal hearing in immigration court. And that raises some really fundamental questions about fairness in the system where the stakes are just so incredibly high.
So, at the end of the day, what we're left with is this fundamental tension. The debate over abolishing ICE isn't really just about one agency, is it? It's about a much, much bigger question that sits right at the heart of the whole issue. It's really asking us, when national security and civil liberties clash, where do we as a society decide to draw the line?